we conclude the introduction to the transmission of the Torah, and the Mishnah tells us the Nevi'im had transmitted it to the men of the High Assembly. They said three things. Having musun badin, be deliberate in judgment, meaning a judge, regardless of his qualifications, caliber, he has to allow his decision to percolate before he actually gives an official verdict. It means you should be deliberate or withhold judgment until you've actually reflected on it many times and discussed it. Hamidu Talmidim Harbeg. You should try to mentor as many students as you can. Asusio of the Torah, and make offense for the Torah. Let's speak about Hamidu Talmidim Harbeg. We'll get back to the Mesunim Badin. So there's a verse in Mishlei where King Solomon says that although one has children when you're younger, and although you fulfilled your obligation of procreation, if you're able to father children later in life, if you can, you should. Why? Because maybe the later children will surpass the earlier children in their ability, their capacity, and their potential. So therefore, although you've already brought children into existence, the latter ones may surpass the earlier ones. So simple understanding of Shlomo is referring to bringing children to the world. However, we know that we learn, the Torah goes and speaks about the progeny of Moshe and Aaron, and it only tells us about Aaron's children, doesn't mention Moshe's children in Torah. So the Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us, from here we learn, Kol HaMalami Torah Ben Chavero, a person who teaches a fellow Jew Torah, meaning he mentors them in Torah, Kilu Yoldo, as if he actually fathered him. Why? Because the whole development of character, personality, and emotion is very much determined based on the mentoring of Torah, because Torah, since the essence of every Jew is his soul, the physical is only the setting, is only the circumstance. So what has the greatest impact on the person is his spiritual development. And since the ultimate spiritual development comes through the study of Torah, so the teacher who teaches that person a significant amount of Torah, so he has his hand in the evolvement, development of that person. It's as if he gave birth to him. So when Shlomo says, Baboke zara zarecha, in the morning you should plant your seed, but even towards evening, you should not withdraw your hand. He's referring to, although you had mentored students in younger years, if you're able to mentor students in your latter years, you should, because the students that you mentor in your later life may surpass the students that you mentored when you were younger. It's interesting. You know, in terms of raising a child, bringing a child into existence, we have no idea. You have two children from the same parents. Sometimes you wouldn't even believe they're brothers in terms of their strengths and their weaknesses and the direction they're going. So there's no question. See, if you have children, even at the earlier part of your life, they're so dissimilar and very often, regardless of how much input you have in their lives, because each person has his own so-called unique profile or personality and other gifts which he's endowed with. Identically, the children you bring in later in life, same idea. Therefore, if you're able to have children later, although you fulfilled your obligation of procreation, you should continue to have children. If you mentored students in younger years, where usually when you're younger, you didn't have the level of knowledge and acumen in Torah and experience, there's no question if you're able to mentor students later in life, where your capacity is even greater, there's no question you definitely should mentor students. Because the end product based on the source of the information, it's a more profound influencer than when you were younger. So the same idea. That's Hamidu Talmidim Harbe. That if you're able to establish persons, I'm going into retirement. No, a person is able to disseminate Torah, there's no retirement age. As long as you're able to teach and disseminate and influence and impact on people, there's no retirement age. You continue doing it. And that's Hamidu Talmidim Harbe. What is the objective of creation? We've discussed this endless times. Is for the sake of Torah. Who has the greater impact on anybody other than the one who disseminates, who teaches? The role model for what Torah is. It's the one who teaches. Hamidu Talmidim Harbe. Establish, mentor as many students as you can. Well, I have enough. I've mentored enough. No. Because we speak about, a person brings about a certain degree of Kiddush Hashem. And you're able to magnify that Kiddush Hashem. You say, well, I've done enough. I mean, you're here to sanctify God's name, to magnify his name, and put it in the most prominent place. So through students, mentoring him properly, and they being representations of what the Torah is, there's no question. If you have that ability, you definitely should do it. Because that itself is a Kiddush Hashem. That's the sanctification of God's name. Hamidu Talmidim Harbe. So what is the value, the symbol of Hamidu Talmidim Harbe? If you're able to mentor other students, more students, definitely. Firstly, they may surpass the early ones. And even if they don't, you're still mentoring people in a responsible way. And they're beneficiaries of your mentoring. Chaim Voloshin, in his commentary, Pirkei Avos, explains it this way. The Gemara tells us that Harbe Lomadati Mital Rabosai. I've learned enormous amount from my teachers. This is Rav's statement. Michavero Yosemi Rabosai. From my colleagues more than my teachers. Umitalmide Yosemi Kulam. And for my students more than my teachers, more than my colleagues. Why? Because through the dissemination of Torah, the simple understanding is the dialogue. When you enter into dialogue, although you may believe that you have the proper understanding, but the more you engaged in terms of dissemination, it brings another level of clarity. It brings another level of clarity. They ask the question and the back and forth. The Gemara tells us, the Torah is compared to a tree, to wood. Just as a small piece of wood, a small ember ignites a large log, identically, a lesser student ignites the teacher. That's this lesser could actually advance the greater through igniting him. So through the process of the give and take, the dialogue in Torah, the teacher becomes a greater teacher. So Hamidu Talmidim Harbe, establish, mentor as many students as you can. It's not for the sake of the student. It's for the sake of the teacher. The teacher advances in his understanding as a result of mentoring students. The mentoring is only the means for the teacher to advance at his own level of Torah. That's the Reb Chaim Voloshin. But the simple understanding is, again, as it says, Baboka Zara Zarecha, the verse in Mishlei, although you plant you seed in the morning, the Erev al Tonich Yodechi, towards evening, you should not withdraw your hand, because maybe the latter will outpace the earlier. The younger student, the students that you mentor early in your life, may not be as good as the students you mentor later. Therefore, as long as you're able to mentor, you continue mentoring the students. I once said, the Gemara tells us that one success in Torah is not only based on IQ, on intellect. It's based on siyata d'shmaya. It's based on one's Hashem willing to provide a certain divine assistance, a clarity coming upon the truth of Torah. That's what it's determined by. Now, the Gemara tells us, the Talmud tells us that it's called siyata d'shmaya. Siyata d'shmaya, divine assistance. Now, if a person sincerely accepts upon himself to study Torah, to be a student, the student needs siyata d'shmaya, that you should be a beneficiary of giving it your wherewithal, trying to become a student of Torah. Let's say now you've already developed in a student of Torah. Now you're ready to study on your own. And now you have a peer group. Now, to be able to listen to another person's position, if it's the Rebbe-student relationship, the teacher-students, of course, the student is there to listen to what the rabbi has to say, what the teacher has to say. But if you have two colleagues and each one feels he could learn independent of a teacher, so that means I have my understanding, you have your understanding. When we enter into a discussion to elucidate the subject matter, if there's egos involved, it's not so simple. Because there's me, this is what I hold, you hold differently. You agree, you disagree. But a person usually, he values what he understands more than he values the other person. But a person who's agreeable to get involved in this interchange and this dialogue, it requires a certain degree of humility. I'm willing to listen to what the other person has to say because I have an interest. That means you're swallowing your pride to a degree. So a person who studies through the dialogue with a peer, he merits a greater siyata d'shmaya. Because the sacrifice for that, you're already an adult, you're learning on your own, and yet, despite that, I'm agreeable to consider what the other person says. What about a Rebbe versus a student? What is he assuming responsibility? He's assuming responsibility for Hashem's flock. I'm accepting upon myself responsibility to disseminate Torah to the masses. That's a Rebbe-student relationship. That's Talmidei Yosef Kulam. He says, Rava says, as a student, it's the most minimal level of siyata d'shmaya. As a colleague, as a peer, a more greater level of siyata d'shmaya. As a teacher, assuming responsibility for students to mentor them, to develop them, you merit even a greater level of siyata d'shmaya. Samidu talmidim harbe, the more students you assume, you accept responsibility to mentor them, the teacher, because he's assuming a greater level of responsibility, he merits a greater level of siyata d'shmaya, and due to that, his level and grasp of Torah continuously advances exactly for that reason. So that's the Hamidu Talmidim Harbe. That's what the Anshe Knesset do. Mentor as many students as you can. Asu shiog Torah. Make a fence for the Torah. What do you make a fence? The Torah says that whatever the rabbis legislate, whatever they promulgate, you're bound to them. Rabbinic laws, the Torah says you're bound to what the rabbis are empowered to make fences to protect the Torah. Now, what is the concept of a fence? We discussed many times. A road has guardrails. What do you have guardrails? You have a guard, even if an 8-lane highway, you have a guardrail, and a person always rides the middle lane. The shoulder is as wide as the lanes themselves on each side, but nevertheless, you still have a guardrail off to the side. Because you never know, a person may lose focus, and through distraction, he may end off close to the edge of the road. So what prevents him from going off the road? You have the guardrail, that's the buffer, that stops him. And I always discuss, sometimes you go and you travel, the guardrail is only a piece of cable, metal cable. And sometimes you have a guardrail, it's actually a metal girder spanning the length of the side of the road. If you have small vehicles driving the road, the metal cable may be enough to restrain the car, to hold the car back from going off the road. But if you have Mack trucks driving down that road, the Mack truck goes into that cable, it's like the cable doesn't exist there. So what do you need? You have to put strong girders to withstand the impact of the truck if it should actually veer in that direction, to hold it on the road. It depends who you are. The rabbis legislate fences because the human being is prone to fail because of lack of cognizance, distractions. So even if you're distracted, at worst, you've violated rabbinic law because we keep you a distance from the Torah law. We make many laws to sensitize you, to give you an understanding of what is and what's not. For instance, to give you an example, there's a concept known as muktzah. There's certain items are not permitted to move, to touch, if they can be moved, if they have no relevance to Shabbos. For instance, money. Since you're not permitted to engage in any purchase or transaction, financial transaction, money has no value. Since money has no value, you're not even permitted to touch it. What about, you're not permitted to write on Shabbos. If you have a writing implement, a pen, a pencil, whatever it may be, it's off limits. Why is it off limits? Because again, since its value has no relevance to Shabbos, because you're not permitted to write on Shabbos, therefore, the instrument through which you form the letters, you're not permitted to engage in. But what about items which are permitted? For instance, you're permitted to eat. You need a fork and a knife and a spoon. Those are utensils which have relevance to Shabbos. Because they have relevance to Shabbos, you're permitted to engage with them, to touch them, to move them. But something that has no relevance to Shabbos, as I gave examples, a power tool, or a spade, a shovel, whatever, you're not permitted to dig. Therefore, it's off limits. You're not permitted. What is that offense for? So the Rambam explains, based on the Talmud, that all week we transport from domain to domain without even thinking. Public domain, private domain, all kinds of domains, without any hesitation, without any thought. Shabbos comes, now all of a sudden there's laws which pertain, what could you transport, what can't you transport, and where could you transport it? You're not permitted to transport from public domain to private domain or vice versa. You're not permitted. And there's certain rabbinical domains, because it has a semblance of public domain, rabbinically you're not permitted to carry there. But what's the value of creating a provision to carry? Because now that you have to discern between what has relevance to Shabbos or not, that gives you an understanding that the reason why is because you should not transport from domain to domain. Other person, we go by our own habits. We're creatures of habit. All week we transport domain to domain without thinking. Anything we pick up, we transport. The answer is Shabbos, it's not anything you pick up, you transport. You have to think before you engage in anything. Is it permitted for me to touch? It's not permitted for me to touch. Has relevance? Yes. No, not. That creates already an understanding that today's not like the weekday. Today's the day, everything has an evaluation that you need a discernment. Otherwise, you're not permitted. But that itself is offense, not to transport from domain to domain, understanding that today is different than an ordinary weekday, where there many things are open to do as you choose to do, as long as it's not within the area of transgression. That's asusi og Torah. So the rabbis made their fences because they feel the areas of lack of cognizance, which apply to every Jew. Therefore, we have to legislate fences to keep the Jew arm's length from transgressing. But every one of us know we have our personal issues. We have our personal weaknesses, which one person's weakness is not another person's weakness. For that, a person has to accept upon himself certain fences not to cross the line. I'll give you an example. A person goes to a nutritionist and they tell him, got to take off 30 pounds. And the nutritionist asks him for a list of foods that he normally eats. So the nutritionist says, something? Those foods should never be brought into your house, ever. Now going forward. That because since you're conditioned to eat those foods, the moment you think about it, you start craving. And if they're available, you can eat it. So how do you stop the enemy at the pass? Just don't bring the food into the house. By not bringing the food in the house, you're not going to be tempted. And even if you crave, there's no temptation to take because it's not available. That's offense. I choose not to bring it in, although I would like to have it available, But that prevents me from crossing the line to eat something which the doctor says it's not in my best interest to eat. That's what it is. There are many things. If they'd be available or closer, we would engage in them. The rabbis keep us arm's length from certain areas. For instance, law is you're not permitted rabbinically to have milk immediately after a meat meal. Why? Because the Torah says cooking milk and meat is not permitted. Cooking. You want to have a glass of milk with meat? It's on a Torah level, it's permitted. It's rabbinic. Because people were very logical beings, rational beings, they said. It doesn't make any sense. If I'm permitted to drink the milk with my meat, why can't I saute the meat in milk? Why can't I marinate in milk and then broil it? Why not? The flavor is phenomenal. So people don't understand there are differentiations. And the differentiations only make a difference if you never engage in that type of behavior. Therefore, the rabbis say you have to keep arm's length. After you eat meat, you can't have milk. You eat a meat meal, you have to wait 6 hours before you have a dairy meal. That's the degree of distance you have to. So once it's established as something to be so extreme, all the other pieces of this law fall into place. Although waiting period is only rabbinical. But by establishing that rabbinical, it gives a sensitivity that there's no mingling of meat and milk under any circumstance. So all these laws are fences. But on a personal level, you also make fences. As I say, person has a certain need to stay away from, he's a diabetic. He's not permitted to eat certain kinds of foods, and they can only be eaten within limitation. Again, that cabinet's under lock and key. Whenever he wants food from the pantry, he has to ask for the key. They'll give him the key. But knowing that you have to ask for a key, that means there's something in that pantry that's not in your best interest to eat. Therefore, the key is provided because now that you know what you shouldn't eat, the person probably will not take and partake of what he should not eat. Understanding is detrimental to him. That's the understanding. That's asusio la Torah. We're not that far off from Shuas. We find at Sinai, God put a mountain over our heads. And he says, either you accept the Torah or you can be buried under the mountain. So the commentators ask a question. If we already said Nasiv Nishma, if the Jews accepted unequivocally, why is God putting a mountain over our heads? Person says, I want you to do me a favor. Person, I'm more than happy to do you a favor. It'll be my privilege to do you a favor. Person says, if you don't do me that favor, I'm going to break every bone in your body. What are you talking about? I just said it's my privilege to do whatever you ask me. So what do you threaten me all of a sudden now? That if I don't do what you're asking me, you're going to break every bone in my body. We already said Nasiv Nishma. We accept it unequivocally. God puts the mountain over our head and says, if you accept, fine, you'll continue. If not, you'll be buried under the mountain. We said initially, without any incentives, just offering it, we accept it. So what are you being so overly controlling and assertive upon us? It's baseless. It's a baseless concern. So the other commentators give different answers, but the moral of the Orach Chaim HaKodesh explains that we accepted the written Torah, the oral Torah wholeheartedly. But the concept of fences, that the rabbis are going to be endowed with the power to create fences, that the Jewish people weren't willing to accept. They said, if that's the case, there's no end to it. There's no end to fences. They feel they have to take every precaution into effect in reality, and therefore it makes life untenable. Therefore, we don't accept that. We're not accepting that the rabbis should be authorized to rain in on us whatever they choose to, because of a concern. That's why God put the mountain over our heads. The Torah we accepted, written Torah, oral Torah, everything. It's not a problem. But the fences, which could be endless, wherever you turn, you're not permitted to do that or do that. And if you don't understand its innate value, it becomes overwhelming burden. Overwhelming burden, that's what it becomes. So The Jewish people didn't want to accept the fences. God says, you want to know something? Either you accept or you can be buried under the mountain. Why? Because without fences, it's just a question of time before you will fail. Because man is man, the human being has his issues, he has his Achilles heels, he has his weaknesses, and unless you create this infrastructure where you protect him from the outside forces to maintain a level of clarity and attention, it's not going to survive. Therefore, the fences are essential and crucial. And that's why he put the mountain over our heads. Asus the Torah. It says, on a personal level, you have to make fences. Once told the story, this person became a Balchuva many years ago, and he used to love, there was one restaurant in New York which sold game food. And this person was a very physical person. And although he accepted dietary laws, didn't violate them, but whenever he'd be within the proximity of this restaurant, literally, he would crave for that food and his mouth would water. Okay? But on the marriage contract, or whatever it was, so now he knows he cannot walk down that street. If he walks down that street, the temptation is too overwhelming, he's going in there. Or people see him going in there, he'll lose his credibility as an observant Jew. And one day he's walking down the street and he realizes nobody's around him. Maybe he'll sneak in a bite because he had to make a fence. The fence was they shouldn't walk down that street. He walked down the street and sure enough, somebody, as he's about to go in, somebody is coming down the street, a member of his congregation. And if he would go in there, his reputation is over in a moment. So his ego didn't allow him to cross that line. As much as the ego drives and do what you want, I have a right not to be denied, but some of the same ego says, you want to be left in disgrace? Okay.